Okay, so last time we were working on a Google Doc, and I have it open somewhere. Oh, it's open in this window. Okay. Share button. Okay, so last time we had talked a lot about um, use cases, and we fleshed a lot of those simple use cases out for the most part, and um, we started to talk a little bit about requirements. I want to post the link to this document in the chat.
Got it.
Um, there were some I mentioned this to Andrew last time, but I mentioned it to the other group earlier this week. There's a similar, not a similar, there's a complementary effort ongoing right now for CycloneDX. We've got three working work streams at the moment, three different work groups, soon to be four. But one of the other work groups is discussing threat models. So, how do we represent threat models? How do we represent the assets? If we want to do asset-based threat modeling, how do we represent process-based threat modeling? How do we represent the requirements, the assumptions, the threats, the countermeasures, even diagrams potentially? So we are, I think there's going to be a little bit of, I don't want to say overlap, but I do think there's going to be an intersection between the work that we do here in terms of like architecture and behaviors and the work that the threat modeling group is doing, because they also care a little bit about architecture, more
Yeah.
so for like data flow diagrams, but they care about architecture and they care about behaviors because that ties into use cases and that sort of thing. So documenting abuse cases is one of the things that that group would be interested in.
You know, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. As one of the reasons that uh, we do this is to support threat modeling exercises. One of the inputs to a threat modeling exercise ought to be a behavior-based architecture.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I see it. Like it's not doing automated threat modeling, it's just input data. The same as if you got a Visio diagram from the development team or did a questionnaire or interviewed the development team about how their shit works. It just that it's like the facts about how the application actually runs. The judgments about how it runs and how it responds to threats and which countermeasures are good and bad and so on. Like all that is a layer on top of what I think of this as.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Um, the that team, at least for now, has kind of settled on being able to support the typical CIA triad with the addition of privacy and safety. So CIA plus privacy plus safety is what is kind of in scope for the work that that group is going to be doing. So
Not,
so
not
with
accountability,
what's that?
not
Well,
accountability.
you have accountability because I think the attestations.
Oh, I
If
mean,
you
like logging and tracking the behavior of a particular user. Like to me, that their behavior is accountable.
right,
That's
right, right.
it's like people often add that to CIA because it's not really covered in the CIA trust. So it's
I know.
CIA. Just curious.
Yeah, yeah. Still, again, it's still early. We're still discussing things. Lack of logging is certainly something that,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, but right now, as it stands, CIA plus privacy plus safety is kind of what the group is focusing on. But with that in mind, uh, the question originally was, well, was the behavior that we're going to be working on, is it going to be security specific? And I don't think so. Because if we're talking about privacy and safety as well, well, those fundamentally, they might be security things, but they may not be.
Well, they're in the ballpark, right? I mean, I just don't want to try to reinvent, like what app dynamics would generate for a performance view of an application. I don't think that's
Right.
our charter
No.
here. Listen, I'm not that interested in that. I'm much more interested in the sort of the security and security adjacent views of what the application behavior is.
Right. And personally, I'm, you know, I was looking at it potentially more as a higher level type of behavior. I mean, there's modeling languages like for hardware that, get down to like the nuts and bolts, right? And
Yep.
I think that's overkill for
Agree.
what it is that we want to do, because how could you theoretically model something? It's always going to be wrong, because you can't account for every possible if then else, right? I mean, it would,
Right. I mean,
but
the source code is a model of the behavior, right? It's just like a one-to-one. Everything else is more abstract. And
right,
question is, can we find a right useful abstraction of application behavior that's not so detailed that it's like a source code review, but it's got enough meat to allow you to do some of the other things that, some of these use cases.
right, yeah. Um, and I also don't want to reinvent existing specifications, right? I'm not interested in re-implementing UML. That's not something that this group should, even be thinking
Mm-mm.
about. Although I recently realized, when I've used UML previously, it's always been like structural, like how do you arrange classes and
Yeah.
all that sort of thing. Um, I've never used it this way, but supposedly you can model behaviors with UML
Yeah, they
and
have
use
those
cases.
like trace diagrams, right? Like
Right.
interaction diagrams.
So I've never used it that way. I think it's interesting. Um, I don't think I'm really interested in capturing visual diagrams. I think
Oh,
I think the visuals could theoretically be derived from the data that we put in the model, right? I think the model should, focus a lot on automation, because realistically, no human is going to enter the behaviors, right? We need tools to tell us what the behavior is. Um, so a huge focus on automation. And that means that the diagrams are non-existent. However, if you had a consumption tool, you could theoretically derive a diagram from the data that we're trying to represent. So that's kind of my thought process.
yeah, I'll share some experience. Our model is exactly that. Like, let's capture all the data first, get it into our system so that we can, show people what uh, the behaviors are, and then build visualizations of that. And we spent the last year figuring out how to create visualizations of our data. And the reason we spent that time is because you need visualizations. Everyone asks for it. Like, you can't really use just a JSON uh, dump of what the behaviors are. It's not easy to understand or get your head around or make conclusions about. The visuals make it a lot easier.
Right.
But I don't know if you need, like, eventually I think people want to put rules on top of the data, like independent of the visualization. Like, once you gather that data, then you can start saying, like, show me routes that don't do authorization. Okay, that's a great question to ask. And for that, there's like rule engine on top of this. Then you're starting to get more into threat modeling,
Right.
automated threat modeling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I kind of see this as an input to a threat model. And
I'd
being
like to
able to
see that as,
represent both would be amazing.
yeah, I like a lot of these use cases, but they're not in the priority order that I
Oh,
would
we
put.
didn't prioritize them.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth thinking about because to me, the the number one use case is just to understand what your application does. So like whether it's a development team or an operations team or a security team, just to be able to understand what that application does is critical. The next one, I think of four actually. There's to me, it's threat modeling, pen testing. Uh, this blueprint feeding into a pen test is incredibly valuable. It tells you where you should spend your time and where, more importantly, where you should not spend time.
Right.
Uh, putting the third is putting vulnerabilities in context. So everyone complains about risk prioritization because they don't have enough context to make a great risk rating. The blueprint provides the context for that. It says, oh, that vulnerability is on a route that is only accessible by admins. And it talks to a database that's only got read-only data in it and shit like that. So like that context for risk prioritization is critical. And the same thing in production, the context for an incident is incredibly important because
Context for an incident. Okay.
yeah,
Right.
it's threat model, pen test, risk rating, incident response. That's the four that I care about.
Got it. No, that makes perfect sense.
And I'm happy to add those here somewhere if you want me to write them up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the examples that I was thinking of, but it had to do about like log4shell. I can't remember if we captured that or not, but we certainly talked about it last time. Like, yeah, like I think I threw out an example about log4shell, right? Where, if the behavior says, maybe my application is vulnerable to log4j. And again, that vulnerability is represented in CycloneDX, and I know that. I've got the behavior of the application that says inputs coming into the application, it's being processed, it's being persisted, and you realize that input validation is being skipped. Therefore, I'm going to deploy a WAF temporarily and automatically in front of that service while the development team actually spends time fixing it. You know?
Yeah, I think we'll find that input validation is one of the harder things to represent in a blueprint, but I agree with the sentiment. Like
Yeah, I
the
know.
use
I
case for
agree
almost
too.
anything else is not hard to understand, like SQL injection or expression language injection or XXE or SSRF. It's
Right.
just when you get into
Getting into it, is this actually there or not? It's like, oh, well, we have input validation, but you did it incorrectly, then you still have the bug, right? So,
well, that's really hard. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it
yeah,
is regexes and like validating regexes automatically is kind of a thing. Like that's
right. But once you get into
Yeah.
any kind of Turing machine analysis, you're not solving things in the general case, right? So
And I
you get
think that's,
approximations.
I think this is, yeah, approximations I think are good because, if we're talking about behaviors, I don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, right? I don't want this
Mhm.
to be like an audit thing. Oh, your input validation isn't good enough. The fact, just being able to represent that they do it
doing something.
or not,
Yeah.
I think is probably that sweet spot that we want to go to because you can argue about double encoding and all these kinds of crazy stuff. Is it good enough? Um,
I mean, is a behavior is input validation like high enough of a level of behavior? Because I think last time when we talked, we were thinking like, what is the way you actually think about a behavior? Because you can go into really low level and say, well, there's an if statement in front
yeah,
of, like that's like you're getting
yeah,
too low, right?
yeah, yeah,
So like
The
what?
way I think about it is like at the sort of diagram level, you want to show whether major security controls are, I actually, so the kinds of things that I think ought to be captured are attack surface. And there's four things here too. It's attack surface, security controls, dangerous behavior, and backend connections.
Attack surface, what?
Security controls
Controls.
or defenses, dangerous behavior. And this is not vulnerabilities. This is just like, you know,
Right.
using the file system or making a SQL query. They're dangerous. And then the last thing is connections.
Is
This
that like
is
outbound initiated connections? Or like, because
generally,
isn't that
communications.
part of the attack surface?
if it's an input, it's an attack surface. It's an outbound connection. I
Outbound
mean, an
initiated,
outbound
right?
connection pulls data back in, and so it becomes input at that point. So then
Right.
it's part of the attack surface, but it's useful to think about sort of the publicly accessible endpoints and then the initiated connections.
Right.
But those are the four things. And so, you know, when I talk about, you know, like security controls, I think there's a level at the diagram where we just say like, oh, it's encryption happens here. But then you should be able to click into that and get the next level of information like, oh, this is triple des, whatever. And so that's how I kind of think about it. There's categories for all these things. And then details if you click into them. And, you know, sometimes the details are like, you know, if it's a connection, it's like, well, what host is it going to? What database is it talking to? What table is it accessing? Is it read or write? Like those are simple kinds of attributes that'll allow you to understand that connection. Is it over SSL? Just, you know, threat modeling level details of this stuff, but enough to tell you that there might be a control missing or that ultimately to me, that's like the big point of this is to understand, you know, what controls are there and assurance that you're protected or, you know, potential issues that need to be investigated.
Right. Okay. So if we're talking about, if we look at that first thing, if we look at attack surface.
Yeah.
We need to model, we have components and services, but we don't have other things, right? We don't have, well, let's see, if we talk about specifically attack surface. I think a lot of security people assume that the network is the only attack surface, and it's not. You know, like
Yeah.
reading a file from disk.
Sure, a config
Okay.
file or something. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So these
For
are
environment
things
variables.
right. These are things that CycloneDX, well, environment variables we can handle, but like a the file system, right? That's not something that CycloneDX natively supports today.
Hmm.
So if we want to represent that part of the attack surface, then that's something we would need to add. Services we have covered. Now we can.
So is that, so I just want to be clear. I thought that services, the way they're modeled in CycloneDX is more like a back-end connection. It's like a dependency of an application.
No, you can have nothing but services. It doesn't have to tie to a component at all. It's pretty cool.
But
You can do it like a SaaS bomb. So you can
yeah, I know,
represent.
I'm familiar with SaaSBomb.
So you
Well,
can say that this service connects to this other service and transmit this type of you know, data,
yeah.
right? And you can kind of draw that entire map and what connections are going where and what kind of data classifications.
So does it model outbound connections or inbound connections?
Both.
Okay, so that's great. Because I think attack surface to me is inbound connections or files or you know, anything that's being consumed by the application kind of through the front door. And then the backdoor services are more what I think of like outbound initiated connections.
Right. But things that are like local machine things. I mean, theoretically, I guess we could represent the disk as a device, but we can't necessarily represent a file system per se.
Isn't
But
it
we could
kind of
represent
like a
disk.
back-end connection though? If I read a file, whether I read it from an API or I read it from the file system, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of
Yeah,
the same thing with environment variables, a little more abstract, but like you're asking the operating system, like, give me something. It's just the call is going to the local API as opposed to a remote API. But as far as
right.
this threat diagram, I mean, it's, I don't know if it
It's a
matters.
read, right? It's a read or a write or
Yeah.
whatever. Either way,
Yeah.
once you get down to the code. So depending on your level of abstraction, it, you can do it either way.
One thing that we don't have, let's see. One thing that might be missing is if I have, well, is it missing? Just being able to represent an application and the endpoints that application exposes. Okay, that's like the first thing that we need to figure out. Can CycloneDX do that today? If not, how, what changes do we need to do to make it do that? Can CycloneDX do that today?
Yeah.
Yes, it can. It can do that today.
If we model them all as services.
Well, you'd have the application.
Yeah.
At the application would be the meta application, and it would be basically a collection of services. And the let's see. I think the one thing that might be missing is right now it's more of a dependency relationship,
That's what I was
and
getting at
it's
earlier. You think of a
yeah,
service as a dependency rather than like an attribute of the application itself.
we introduced this concept in cryptography bill of materials called provides, and we might want to think about, hey, this application provides these services,
Yeah, it
right?
exposes them.
Right. So
Yeah, I like that.
that's that's something that we could uh realistically do to kind of make that a little bit more clear, that these are not just dependencies, these are, these are provided by the application, exposed by the application.
So but you still think the service definition would work. It's just this application provides this service as opposed to consumes this service.
Yeah, right. It's
Yeah,
not
I love
just
that.
another component you just, right. Exactly. So I think with a few minor tweaks, we should be able to do that. Let me capture this as a note. Um, all right, I think that makes sense. I think it's a very minor tweak.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, it doesn't feel like a dependency to me. Like,
Right.
just naturally, like an endpoint, it doesn't, I don't depend on the endpoint. Well, sort of I do, like I depend on it for input, but it's a little weird to talk about it that way.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Okay, I like that.
Security controls.
This is, typical categories of defenses. So
Right.
authentication, access control, input validation, encryption, logging, sanitization, those kinds of things. That's what I'm thinking here. And each one has details with it.
Right.
Encryption, logging. I don't know if you want to list them all, just maybe it'll help in the future. I think I said,
Yep.
yeah. Yep.
Okay, no, that makes sense. That's kind of what I was thinking too. So in the threat modeling group, we're talking a little bit about requirements and even controls, right? Even controls can map back to either requirements or missing requirements. What's your view on security controls as being a requirement versus being something else?
I honestly don't think of them as requirements at all. Like, I mean, they might be required by some standard, but what matters to me is how they're actually implemented in the running application or in the application itself. You could compare the blueprint against the requirements and look for deltas, like, oh, if you had a requirement that said every route must have authorization, then you could look at the blueprint and easily see like, oh, that violates that requirement. But I don't know. I mean, I'm a little hesitant to tie things to requirements because I don't think people really use security requirements documents. They're, in most cases, they're just on a shelf somewhere or in a confluence somewhere where people aren't looking at them. The developers don't know where they are, much less what's in them. And so like what matters to me is recording what the application actually does. And like in some sense, the requirements are a super high level model of the behavior of the application, but it's not connected to reality. It's just like some security guy's dream of what security ought to look like in the application without any details. Like saying do input validation doesn't mean jack. And almost all the requirements documents are like that. I've written a bunch of them, and it just
And
they're
all
not
you
helping
developers
developers.
ignore them.
They're not specific enough. I mean,
Right.
there's good money in it if you're a consultant, but it doesn't help anything. And I'm trying to focus on things that matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. It's these are like what is it? What is the ground fruit, right? These are about what are the actual things that are implemented in this piece of software, in this system, etc. Right? And the requirements are, well, that's definitely something else. Have that be in the threat model, right? The threat model assumes this or whatever, or maybe have a secondary like blueprint of like, this is the blueprint that we want. Here's the blueprint as it actually exists, and you can diff the two, right? But I think that's something different than
Yeah.
putting it in the blueprint as a requirement.
Right.
Yeah, I think it would be very difficult to make a blueprint of the expected defenses because like in the real blueprint, the defenses are tied to specific routes. Like it's layered on top of the actual behavior of the application or API. Whereas, with the requirements, you don't have that. You just say like, well, all input needs to be validated or, all private PII needs to be encrypted. And it has no relationship to the actual software architecture. So I think it'd be tough to do what you're saying. Like you'd almost have to have the blueprint first and then go in and like layer the security requirements in, but it's probably faster to just look at what's actually there.
Right. Right.
Well,
Right.
right. I think that's actually how if I were to do this, I want a blueprint first and say, okay, well, here's all of the network interfaces. I need to have authentication on each one of these, right? Is that actually there? So it's like
Yeah.
you'd build the requirements like after the fact because you don't necessarily know until you build the blueprint. You don't know what's even there to like defend against, right?
Right. Like
Would
I
you?
didn't know they were going to use Corba.
Oh,
I can
it's
see you get
Friday,
hurt.
man.
Someone who hurt you? Who hurt you, Steve? Like,
My brain's about to hemorrhage.
oh, we'll just represent it in ASN.1. Fine.
Oh God. Okay. Um, I was thinking about the categorization of security controls. Would this be something that we can pull directly from this 853 control sets?
I don't know. Sure. Yes.
Does anybody know of like a taxonomy of security controls?
OWASP has proactive defenses.
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it needs to be like at the level of 853, unless you're just looking at the very high level categories,
Yeah.
because
Again, like encryption or
yeah,
authentication
exactly.
authorization.
That's the level. I think we could point to it as a list, but I think you might want to have it be extensible, right? Like somebody's going to invent some new kind of access control. It won't be role based or attribute based. It's going to be like, iPhone based access control or something. And I think it is an extensible enum somehow.
Right.
Because I know there's going to be new controls coming out for AI, and
Oh yeah.
new threats need new controls, and it's dumb to try to say this is the list for all time.
Right. Yep. No, that's very, very true. Okay. So this should not be overly difficult.
I do think that we need the next level down, though, of like when you click on encryption, you need the details of, something like what would be in a C-bomb, right?
Okay. All right. All right. What about for
Yeah.
things like authentication authorization? Do you
Yeah,
need the details on
absolutely. You should
that?
know what kind of, is it, two-factor? Is it,
Right.
uh, assertions? Is it like, there's a million ways to do authentication. Is it token? Is it session? Is it like, I mean, all that kind of stuff kind of matters.
Yeah, but you have to get to the point where it's like, hey, this has encryption, great. You're like,
Right.
is
It's
it
ROT 13,
right? Exactly. I'm like, oh,
which I've seen multiple times in
what?
applications.
Well, yeah. I mean, it, you know, where it's like, hey, we're doing a hash. What kind of hash? MD5. It's fine.
Well, it is fine for some things.
For some things, right? But you have to know, right?
So we measure running applications and we see MD5 everywhere. It's in drivers. It's in, I mean, there's probably not an application on the planet that is not using MD5 in some way. And we see all that. And it's interesting, but then you got to look and go like, okay, well, what are we using it for?
What is it being
Why,
used for?
what's it part of? Are we just, using a hash algorithm and slotting stuff into buckets? Okay, maybe it's fine. Like there's all kinds of,
Right.
Right. Are we actually using this
or is it like
for
your
real or
authentication
for
speed? Right. That's
right?
different.
Like, oh, maybe not. But yeah,
Now,
I think
would you
that's where it has to
include,
go deeper.
like for something like logging, details for logging might be what? Like you have an audit log? Do you have um what type of events are being logged? I don't know what kind of details something like logging would entail.
That's a good question.
Probably depends on well, if we're talking about security and not other kinds of behaviors, since I feel like we've just been focusing on the security, like you probably don't, you care a lot about different kinds of logs. So it's like, hey, authentication logs, is that happening? Because you probably need that for a lot of tracking stuff. Debug logs, I mean, whether that's on or not, might be good from a developer perspective. You probably,
Right.
it would be nice to know, like, hey, what stuff is actually being logged and sent out, right? Because that's a different threat, right? Maybe that's back down to dangerous behaviors. It's like, but
Yeah.
knowing what is being logged, where's it going, that's actually,
I think where's it going is kind of interesting. Like, is it local file system? Is it syslog? Is it,
Going to Splunk or
uh, right, exactly.
is it being shipped off into the internet somewhere? Like,
right.
Is it
Right.
important
console?
things to know,
Like console logs are pretty ephemeral usually. So like it's, there's,
right?
uh, is it using a library with known vulnerabilities?
Is,
My brain might hemorrhage again.
Like,
just log that.
Where?
Just use whatever logging for Java exists, right? It's fine.
yeah.
Okay. All right. All right.
What format might be interesting? Like,
Yep.
JSON logging is becoming really popular.
Yep.
Is it going to a logging API, like on the back end somewhere? That
Yep.
kind of stuff.
Oh. Dangerous behavior. Now,
Yeah.
I don't think we can talk about dangerous behavior without talking about intent. Or am I incorrect?
I absolutely think you can.
Can.
Yeah.
I'd say the opposite. So, well, dangerous can mean a lot of things, right? Kind of my example before is encrypting your hard drive dangerous. Well, it's either very dangerous or needed,
Yeah, but
and
the
actually
question
is
is,
more secure.
should it show up in the blueprint? And if your application is doing dangerous things that could involve risk if they're done wrong, that's what should show up in the blueprint. So things like making SQL queries, parsing XML, sending URLs to backend
Okay, so
systems.
it's not really dangerous behavior. It's behavior that is more susceptible to things going wrong.
Yeah, I think of them as dangerous functions. Like when I think about it, it's like these methods are dangerous. Starting a native process is a dangerous thing to do. You can do it safely, but it's still got dangers associated with it.
Right.
We can change it. I'm not locked into the term. I just like that's how I think about it. Is like those are things that there's dangers.
I just think there's nothing that's inherently dangerous for exactly the reason you just said, right?
But that's
If it's done the right way, then you're fine. Or if it's done with, if it's actually intended to happen, then that's okay.
yeah. But if you
Maybe
look
this
at
is like,
all the look at all the vulnerabilities that are out there, every single one of them is associated with some underlying functions that people called wrong. So like in Java, there's a handful of methods that are used to communicate with the database. Every SQL injection flaw that's out there is uses those functions wrong. And
right,
that's
but
what
those
I'm trying to
functions
capture.
are right, but those functions themselves aren't dangerous, right? It's the dangerous use of those behaviors.
No,
Yeah,
it's the
it's
wrong use of those functions. They are dangerous, just like a chainsaw is fucking dangerous. You can use it safely, but it's god damn it, it's dangerous. And it's how you use it. You don't give haircuts with it.
I would love to model that. Can CycloneDX be used?
Some things are dangerous, regardless of your intent. It's dangerous.
I mean, maybe risky is like a, I don't know, maybe that's how I think about it. It's like it can be risky. Dangerous implies that if you use it, like there's going to be some issues, right?
But that's like reckless or negligent. You know, it's like the wrong word for that. It's
It's
So one
dangerous.
of
well, it's dangerous. You can still
one
do
of the
this.
concepts that we were one of the concepts that we were discussing during the threat modeling working group was trust levels. Now, I have a serious issue with the whole concept of a trust level. I think it's just that's backwards. And this is from the OWASP documentation, by the way. This is on the OWASP.org website. Trust levels. I think that's stupid, in my opinion. I think nothing should be trusted. And if you look at, like, say, for example, from an internal network all the way through a DMZ to the public net, to the public internet, right? There's this notion that, oh, I trust it because it's internal. That's just dumb. My view, and this kind of relates to what we're talking about with dangerous, and we might be able to wrap both of these concepts together into one possible solution. What it is, in my mind, is not an inherent thing of trust. It's the likelihood of shit going bad. So the likelihood of shit going bad is much higher on the public internet as opposed to my private network. But shit's going to still go bad, and I still don't trust my internal network because I don't inherently trust all the devices that are on my network. I buy shit from Amazon. I don't trust half these things.
Right.
But the likelihood of shit going bad is much higher on the public internet. So it's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of things going bad, the confidence of things going bad.
Yeah, the level of risk and risk tolerance.
Yeah, we might be able to frame behaviors the same way. So it's not a dangerous behavior, but it's kind of a measurable slope where some things are relatively benign, up through a scale where things are much more likely to go wrong.
It's really likelihood and impact. It's really risk associated with those functions. Like if you have a function that adds two numbers, yeah, it's probably not exploitable. The likelihood and impact are both super low. Unless there's an integer overflow or some bullshit. I don't let's
I was gonna say, like,
don't start with me.
Two numbers. What numbers should I choose?
All right. There's lots of I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I've never seen that exact thing. But there are other functions that are inherently quite risky because if they go sideways, there's a huge impact, and because they're difficult to use correctly. That's what drives the risk. To me, that makes it dangerous. Dangerous to me is a synonym for risky. I don't know. I like dangerous, but it doesn't. Like I said, I'm not stuck on that word.
Think like DLL injection, right? Like that can be a pretty risky thing to allow on your computer, but basically everyone needs to because there's all kinds of reasons you use it. It's just, what is your tolerance for that? And do you trust that there's actually security controls, right, around that to make sure that you're injecting the right DLL?
Yeah, like modules.
Or just letting I was about to get into the whole every EDR is a rootkit. So, but you're letting it happen. I mean, maybe all the good ones. I mean, yeah, you kind of have to have that level of access to defend well. But then you have more risk in case something gets pushed that's wrong.
I get you're like every example is like you're thinking malware, you're thinking attackers, and that's fine. It's just not the use cases I'm focused on. Like I'm focused mostly on supporting development, supporting operations, and it's the primary use of the blueprint is not about malware. It's about understanding the behavior of the system that I actually designed. But
because you've been talking about security applications of the blueprints this whole time. I think there's a lot of other applications of the blueprint that involve more general safety. And dangerous behavior isn't just, hey, I'm interacting with the operating system in a potentially dangerous way. It can be, hey, I'm interacting with, I don't know, a linear accelerator in a in a dangerous way, right?
for
So
sure.
like, those are different things that could be risky.
Yeah, and I'm talking about those. I'm blurring together those things inside security, like privacy and safety and security adjacent stuff. For purposes of this, I think it's all the same. There's security controls or controls that deal with that problem, and there's dangerous behaviors that we're trying to prevent from going sideways.
Right. From the developer perspective, it's sort of like, okay, you're using this thing. Did you actually put the guardrails in that you needed to make sure
Yeah.
it's not going to be used
Right,
in
right.
in the wrong way? Did you actually check that before you did a stir copy, right?
Yeah. And so, Steve, my rule for like whether we should try to accommodate it in this model is like roughly, is it does that dangerous behavior, is that at the root of one of the classes of things we care about? Like, is it at the core of SQL injection, expression language injection, XXC, SSRF, or whatever? Like, if it's the root cause of that problem, that's, I want to see it in the diagram or in the blueprint. Like, I want it there.
Right. Coming back to, what is the likely, yeah, root cause of a vulnerability class.
Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I just called it a badnessometer, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, generally that's a pejorative term, right? Like people like that's all we have in AppSec today is like badnessometers. We don't have goodnessometers, and hopefully attestations and stuff gets us there. But one cool thing about this is that it shows where those dangerous behaviors are not in the application. If you've got
Right.
routes that are clean and don't have interesting stuff happening on them, like who cares? Like it's fine. It doesn't do anything that's particularly dangerous.
So let me flesh that out a little bit. So if you had a CycloneDX document that didn't have any badness in it, how would you describe that? Would it be a lack of badness? Would it be an assertion that there is no badness?
I would just model it as a lack of badness. Like we didn't see that. It's not on this. It doesn't do that behavior.
It doesn't, we have back to the taxonomy, right? It's like, hey, here's the list of things that we look for, and that none of these are there. Is that basically what you're thinking?
No, I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, well, I'm thinking about,
Jeff, but
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm thinking about a case where, if we're relying on a lot of automation, if a tool doesn't pick up on something, the lack of badness might be just a result of the tool not being good enough.
Yeah. It's nice to
right,
know
false
like, hey, the
negative.
tool checked for these
Right.
things and we didn't see it. So
Right,
maybe actually
right.
that's probably something that we should build into this is the whatever generated this blueprint, we've got to know what it has sensors for. Like what is it capable of detecting? Because that's all we're going to see in the blueprint is what it's capable of. So if you had a static analysis tool that only looked for database interaction, you'd see a blueprint that would just show database interaction. Like that's all it would show, but it wouldn't tell you that there wasn't expression language injection on those routes. So you need to have that declared somewhere. It's like, what did we look for? And by the way, it's really useful to allow organizations to extend this with their own stuff. Like they have their own dangerous behaviors that they're interested in including in the blueprint. Same thing
Right.
with security controls. Like they might have their own authentication scheme or their own access control scheme that they want to be able to add to this.
Right. No, this is a really good conversation, I thought, today. I think we got a lot accomplished. We'll meet again in a couple of weeks. What does the group want to work on next? Do we want to flesh out some of the requirements still? Do we want to flesh out some of the use cases? Do we want to possibly prototype some things? Where do we want to start? Oh, no answer today, but give it some thought. We've got 2 weeks to kind of figure it out. I'll let everyone go. Have a great weekend. I'll publish the recording up on YouTube later today.
Yeah. Do you think we need to grow this group a little bit?
Yeah.
All right. That's
Yeah.
another action item we can think about.
Tell your friends.
Yeah.
I've been telling some people about it already, and I heard earlier today there might be some interest. So
let's no demagogues, just like people that want to actually work. That's my criteria.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. All right.
See you all.
Cheers, everyone.
all right.
Nice to meet
Everybody.
you.
Nice to meet you, Jeff.